Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. It's me Swastika, and in this video we will be discussing UPSC Prelims 2025. We will be doing and analyzing the paper, which is going to be the first part of the video. The second thing that we're going to analyze is the new and the emerging patterns that UPSC is focusing on, and the third thing we're going to analyze is the CSAT paper and the future trends which UPSC can probably give in the next year, which is 2026, based on what the previous year question paper was. So the difficulty level for the paper in 2025 can be considered moderate to difficult, and this is in stark contrast to the prelims paper which was set in 2024, which was considered easy. The cutoff for the general list went around 88, and the cutoff is expected to be lower than that for this year. On the other hand, when we analyze the 2023 prelims UPSC paper, we see that the cutoff was significantly low and the paper difficulty was considerably high. So the trend has been that before 2023, the 3-4 years and the papers were considerably difficult, but the papers which are coming from 2024 and 2025 onwards have been considerably easier, even though the paper this year can be ranked as moderately difficult. So why are we saying that this paper is moderately difficult is because it was more analytical and unpredictable this year, with a new emerging pattern of answering questions. So we know that in 2022 or 2021 UPSC had introduced, at least in the prelim, they had introduced this this new statement format of answering questions, and in 2025 they have introduced this new pattern where when we're answering the MCQ, we will see that the statements go like you'll be given 3 statements, and out of the 3, 1 would be the basic statement and 2 would be the assumptions, and you have to figure out if both the 2 assumptions are accurate and if they are the reason behind statement 1. And this is the kind of question where you can make mistakes, because there is very little difference between, because it will definitely seem like to you that both the statements, statement 2 and statement 3, accurately explain statement 1, and drawing that fine line where you are able to correctly distinguish between the right accurate statement and the accurate explanation for that statement becomes difficult, especially in an environment which is as high pressured as the 2-hour UPSC paper, because you can only go through that once or twice. Another thing is that since they have introduced more of these statement based questions, you have to read it for a significantly longer amount of time, which means that you automatically get less time for other questions. Again, this makes the paper a little more difficult because you have less time for other questions, and instead of being able to do the paper 2 times and do like a revision, you can only do it once smoothly. So that becomes the thing, and that is why the paper becomes a little difficult, because it requires applied conceptual understanding. Now in the second part of this video, let's quickly understand the subject wise breakdown and the analysis and the trend which has continued. Okay, so the first thing is polity. Polity has been my subject. I've studied and read that for 10 years, and I can accurately give you the explanation that the polity questions that they asked this year were not easy. They were not simple straightforward questions because of the variation in how the answers are given, and all of those questions, none of those questions were direct questions. None of them came from fundamental rights, none of them came from the preamble. They which has been the trend for the past few years, they were indirect questions which required applied understanding of different concepts like constitutional mechanisms, the constitutional amendments, panchayat, 9th schedule, so on and so forth. It's not just something that you understand if you read the constitution once, but something you garner and understand if you read it multiple times over, right? So there was a great emphasis on Supreme Court judgments, there was emphasis on constitutional amendments, and it went more than just asking us something about the preamble or the fundamental rights. The questions were not that easy, and they required some understanding of how politics are governed in India. Like there was a question on this speaker which was pretty confusing because it required you to know things better and understand things better, and another question on panchayat which was also difficult. So yeah, those were the difficult questions, and there were very few direct easy questions in polity at least. Let's talk about geography. Geography was highly analytical. The questions seemed to test map literacy, and they were also location based questions, which were, you know, sort of a hybrid between geography and environment. So if you've done environment well and you've done geography well, and if you have a good understanding and you know you're very literate when it comes to understanding maps, then it would have been easy for you. But otherwise these questions were highly analytical. They required you to have, you know, more than just having rote memory of the subject. They required you to understand concepts well and apply those concepts in the right place, in the right position. So yeah, because a lot of questions were based on ocean currents, wind, pressure wells, monsoon patterns, so on and so forth, and all of those are like considered difficult topics. So the questions in geography were not easy, the answers were confusing. There is a definite and a very high probability that you will make some or the other mistake there. Let's talk about economy. Questions were closely linked to the union budget and the recent RBI monetary policy changes. I think there were questions on Rashtriya Gokul Mission when it came to schemes. Again, something which has been picked up from the union budget. And there were also, you know, there was another question on schemes, right? Of course, this time we saw a new trend which we haven't seen before, because the question they required you to actually calculate the deficit, right? So there was a question on fiscal deficit, primary deficit and revenue deficit. We had to calculate the fiscal deficit and the primary deficit, and though it was straightforward, there are people who have made mistakes if they have not revised the concepts properly. So there was a lot of focus on banking sector, on inflation targeting, and so on and so forth, right? By no means was that easy, because I think there was this one question in which the answer was supposed to be 51,500 when we were calculating like the primary deficit, and a lot of people gave the answer to be 58,500. So you had to have, you know, some clear understanding of what the question is asking you, what is the formula that you're using, what is the concept which is being asked. Again, by no means an easy question, right? Modern history, there was heavy reliance on lesser known facts. I don't think a lot of people knew this, you know, line which Gandhi, like there was a lot of focus around Gandhi basically, and he had said this thing that sedition is my only religion, right? And there was confusion between if this was during the Salt, Dandi March, or this was between when Quit India movement has started. Again, this is not something which has been covered in Spectrum, which is what every UPSC aspirant does. So I think that it was a little confusing in terms of the source of the question, right? So it was pretty interesting. Again, the question about Raja Rammohan Roy was pretty straightforward, but there were still, and again, questions on non-cooperation movement were pretty straightforward, which required you to apply common sense. But I mean, there were still lesser known facts, right? And there's still a probability that you can make mistake when you're answering the question. Now let's come to the elephant in the room, which is science and technology. We had a paper which was heavily favored people who came from science and tech background, because they asked a lot of questions on cathode, anode, unmanned aerial vehicle, a lot of questions on science stuff, right? Which people who come from humanities background would sort of have a disadvantage in, and yeah. So that's the thing. And there's a lot of question on, this Kavach system, which was in the news. And there was another question on, in terms of science, there was another question on alternate powertrain vehicles. Again, this is something which you would know, which you would have read, but the options were so close that it became difficult to gauge which one, if all three are right or if only two are right? So that's where the confusion sort of began, which made this paper difficult. Of course, there was a strong linkage to current affairs. There was a question on the missions which were in the news, like Gaganyaan, Axiom 4 and SpaceX, and we had to figure out if they are linked to microgravity. So that question was also tricky, because everyone has done Gaganyaan, everyone has studied about Axiom 4, everyone has done SpaceX, but we don't particularly remember if the term microgravity was used in that, right? So it required you to have some kind of memory. And lastly, there were questions which were exceptional, right? Like there was a question on peacock tarantula, and I personally remember not having read anything about peacock tarantula in the news since like 2020 or 2019, right? That's when it was in the news, and the options when it came were so confusing because it said that it is only available in some forests in India. Right now there is a discrepancy if that is true, if that is not true, and like so there is still a lot of confusion between some of the answers. So the thing is that we have realized that UPSC has really changed their pattern of asking and answering questions. It's no longer about rote memorization. They're checking your conceptual clarity. They're checking your analytical skills, and you need to practice elimination with uncertainty. I think this is something which UPSC is really focusing on, and they have heavily relied on PIB, Indian Express, Hindu. I think there were less questions from Hindu, but definitely a lot of questions from PIB, Union Budget and Economic Survey, heavily covered. Even then it was a difficult paper because the questions were they came from very uncertain sources, and there was a very high probability that you would pick the wrong answer, right? Which is what the entire game is about. So yeah, that's the true thing. And so I am coming to the third part of this video where we talk about cutoffs and CSAT. Let me just tell you that the cutoff for last year was 88, again something we've covered in the beginning of the video. So we're expecting the paper to be more difficult this year. That is point one. Point two is that a lot of questions were tricky, so there is discrepancy amongst the answers which requires discussion. So like at least 4 to 5 questions like that exist in the paper, right? So that's there. So we're I am not expecting the cutoff to be more than 83, but I'm also not expecting it to be more than 80. So I think the range would be between 80 to 83 based on the difficulty level, based on the fact, based on the number of vacancies which are less than last year, based on a lot of other factors, and the options which were given. The trick about these questions, at least for this year, was that they appear easy when you see it, but once you come back home you'll realize that you've made mistakes because of how close the options are put together, and that made this paper slightly tricky, because of which I am expecting the cutoff to drop for the general category to lie between 80 to 83, right? So let's talk about CSAT now. I think CSAT was harder than it was definitely harder than previous year, but it was easier than the CSAT that we have had in other years like 2022, 2023, even 2021. So CSAT will definitely play a big part in elimination and yeah, that kind of thing, definitely. So that's there, and I think it was harder, but I also think that it's not impossible for you to clear it, because only 33% qualifying marks are needed, which is probable, because if you sit down and you solve the paper, you'll easily be able to attempt 50% of the paper, which is 40 questions, and if you're accurate with those questions, then there's a high probability that you will clear it, because you need to answer only 27 questions accurately to clear it. And even if you answer 40 questions, which is what the the average person attempts, and your accuracy levels are high because of mathematics or whatever your strategy has been, then there's a high probability you'll clear CSAT. But the only thing is that this year the paper was harder than last year's. So yeah, I hope this analysis was sufficient, and I think in 2026 the paper is going to be tougher than what it was this year, and also topics which were covered less, like polity, like modern history, would I think have a greater coverage next year. I think the paper this year was also very current affair related, very current affair dominated, very current affair focused, and I think the paper next year would be the opposite. It will focus on stats. You'll have to it'll be more than just current affairs. So yeah, I think that's going to be the trend. Generally UPSC just reverses the the trend. So that's what I've seen with how they do things. So I think that's definitely going to be there, and also I think if the paper is going to be harder next year, the cutoff is going to be expected to be lower. I hope this analysis was useful. Please don't forget to talk in the comment section if you how you thought the paper of prelims 2025 was and what your opinion on this is, and I would definitely enjoy answering your comments. And in case anyone needs if you need consulting in terms of figuring out your approach towards giving this paper or anything else, feel free to drop an email on which has been given in my description below, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy watching my content. Thank you.